Okay, so what we've talked about so far with monohybrid and dihybrid crosses is just normal complete dominance within our normal body cells. So once again, fun, we have to talk about some vocabulary, but those normal body cells within our body are called autosomes. So they're just all the cells in our body that don't have to do anything with our sex chromosomes. So those would be the other, our sex chromosomes. So these are the ones that are the 23rd pair of chromosomes that we have. So that's something to note too, that here it is these are our 23rd pair. And these up here, the autosomes, are the first 22 pairs. Okay? And that's something to know and remember. So these sex chromosomes are the 23rd pair, and those are what, there are some disorders and that are linked to those. And those sex chromosomes are what determine whether we are male or female. So if you're male, you have the sex chromosomes X and Y. And if you're female, you have two X chromosomes. Now, when a baby is conceived, it is determined whether it's male or female by whether it has that Y chromosome. So a man can either give an X chromosome or a Y chromosome. And a female only has the option to give an X chromosome. So the male is the one that determines the sex of the baby, essentially, whether it's going to be a boy or a girl. And so a lot of times fathers are upset, well, why didn't you give me a son? Well, actually, it is the male's fault because they're the only one that can create a son. So Henry, I think it was Henry VIII that killed one of his wives because she didn't give him a son. Well, he should have beheaded himself because he was the one that didn't give the Y chromosome to be able to make it a son. So these X chromosomes here, kind of drew a rough picture of those. They are much larger and they're just much larger. So you can see here they look the same. Here though, the Y chromosome is much smaller, and the Y chromosome does not carry any sex-linked, or they call them X-linked a lot, X-linked disorders, because it just doesn't have that capability. So all of these disorders and all of these examples that we're going to be talking about are all linked to the X chromosome. So that's something that you need to remember. Now if we move here next, some common disorders when we talk about X-linked or sex-linked disorders, there are two major types. We talk about recessive, ones that are caused by recessive alleles, or ones that are caused by dominant alleles. Now, the recessive disorders are much more common than these dominant disorders that are caused by dominant alleles. Now, the recessive, for these recessive disorders, you need two copies of that recessive allele to be present for that disorder to be expressed. And that is the case in females, because remember I said that you have to have two alleles present, and the females have two X chromosomes. So if we look over here at the genotype, then the female would have to have two little letters or recessive alleles to actually express that recessive disorder. Now for a male, he only has two options of what his genotype could be. He either is going to have the dominant allele and he would not be affected by the disorder if it was a recessive disorder, or he has the recessive allele and he has the disorder. So he doesn't have as many options as the female. The female has three options that she can have. If she has two dominant and she's homozygous dominant for whatever disorder we're talking about, she is unaffected because it's a recessive disorder. she can be heterozygous and be considered what is called a carrier of the disorder. So she has one of the dominant and one of the recessive. And then finally, she could be affected by the disorder and have both recessive alleles. So that gives the female much more of a chance of having, of not having the disorder, which is interesting. So, a lot of these recessive disorders are much less common in females than they are in males, just from the fact that females have 3 possibilities, and so they have a 66% chance of not having a recessive disorder, while males with only having 2 possibilities, they only have a 50% chance, right? So recessive X-linked disorders are much more common in males than females. So some examples of disorders that are X-linked are cystic fibrosis, which is has to do with the glands that are in your lungs and in your chest. And people like this usually have trouble breathing. They'll get colds very easily, pneumonia, things like that, and they can't get past them, and they always get this big mucus buildup, and it can kill people, but it is becoming more common that people survive having that disorder. Another is hemophilia, which is, I talked about in class, but is the disorder that people, their blood doesn't clot like it should. And I'll talk about in another workshop probably some more of these disorders, because they're really interesting to talk about, all these different ones. And then you also have red and green color blindness. And so some people are colorblind just to those 2 colors. So they can't see stoplights. They just know that the top circle is red and the bottom circle is green, but they can't distinguish the color. Now I said there were 2 types of disorders. The other is dominant, where you have the dominant allele that causes the X-linked disorder, but these are far less common. And obviously with having the dominant allele, there'd be a much greater chance of getting that, but it is less common. One example is Huntington's disease that attacks the nervous system, and this is pretty much a fatal prognosis if you have that, and it doesn't appear till later in life. But it's just something to remember that these do exist, and it's unfortunate because it is a dominant allele. So, you know, it's much more likely to have a dominant allele than it is to have the recessive, but with it being X-linked, it is much less common. So if we go over here and look at our genotypes here, like I said, the females have the 3 options. They can be unaffected, a carrier, or affected. So the way that we write the genotypes with X-linked disorders is that we write them as superscripts. So if we have, say, for example, a female that is unaffected, her genotype would be X, big H, X, big H. So that's one possibility. Now, if we said that she was just a carrier of the disorder, we would erase this big H over here and we'd put a little h. And so then she would be considered a carrier of a recessive disorder. And then finally, if we said that she was affected by the disorder, she would have 2 little h's. And this would signify that it was a female that was affected by a recessive disorder. Now, like I said before, males only have 2 options. They can either be affected or unaffected by the disorder. So if a male has a big dominant letter, he is unaffected by the disorder. And if he has let's erase this, a small letter, that means that he is affected by the disorder. So fortunately, gentlemen, you only have 2 options of what you can have, either be affected or unaffected. So that does cause your percent chance of getting a recessive disorder much more increased. And that also, you also have to think about that too then, of whether the chances of a man passing something to his son, because with him having only one possibility, if he isn't affected by a disorder, he can't pass that to his son because he would have to give the Y chromosome to his son to be able to have a son. So a lot of disorders that boys have and their fathers don't have it, they don't get it from their father. Even if their father doesn't have it and they have a son cannot get any genetic disorder from their father because the father always gives the Y chromosome for them to end up being a boy. So that's kind of an interesting thing, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. So, okay, so we're going to do an example talking about cystic fibrosis. So if we have a mother that is a carrier for cystic fibrosis, and we have the father has cystic fibrosis. So first off, what we need to do is write the genotype for both the mother and the father. So typically, when you do this, you write the mother here along the top, and then you write the father here along the side. Okay, so the mother is a carrier for cystic fibrosis. So carrier is just another name for heterozygous. So if you write her genotype along the top, her genotype would be X, big H, X, little h. And we're just going to use H's because I'm on that trend. Okay, now our father, he has cystic fibrosis. So he is going to be X, little h, and then if I can, Y, which is a bad Y, but Y. Okay, so when you do these Punnett squares, you